Hello, I'm Joanne Armstrong, one of the consultants assigned to the JAPD validation project. On behalf of the entire ABBH team, I would like to express our appreciation for the opportunity to present the results of our research. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleagues on this project. First, we have Joseph Harding, the lead consultant on the team, and my peers, Desi Batista and Nashima Begum. You will hear from each of them later in this presentation. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. JAPD requested a review of the current selection system with the goal of determining the validity of each component in order to establish whether they are an adequate predictor of performance. This included verification that the knowledge, skills, and abilities identified through job analysis as required for police officers are being measured, and a determination of which of the 4 assessments being used would be most beneficial going forward. ABBH has completed the validation review and identified the utility or cost benefit of each of the 4 assessments. Additionally, the review included an evaluation of adverse impact that might be attributed to the selection system. In this presentation, we will provide an overview of our processes and methodology, recommendations, and next steps for an effective selection system for hiring successful police officers. With that, I would like to turn it over to Joe Harding to explain the outcomes of the validation evidence assessment.
Thank you, Joanne. ABBH Consulting analyzes the 4 assessments currently in use by the JAPD to determine whether they are valid predictors of job performance or not. The 4 assessments reviewed were a general mental ability test, an interview, a job knowledge test, and an in-basket test. We found all individual assessments to be valid and significant predictors of job performance for JAPD officers. The analysis significantly related each predictor to job performance of the JAPD officers. The GMA test was shown to have the strongest relationship of the 4. However, research indicates that cognitive ability tests, such as the GMA test, have a tendency of creating adverse impact on minority populations. This was further reviewed and will be discussed by Desi later. The second strongest predictor of job performance was the in-basket test. The third strongest was the interview, and the weakest relation to job performance was the job knowledge test. These results provided the basis for our next level of analysis and incremental validity study. Incremental validity looks at how a combination of predictors can work together to better predict the criterion, in this instance, job performance. ABBH Consulting reviewed multiple combinations and found 2 to be significant predictors of job performance. The GMA and in-basket tests combined to explain 25% of the variance in JAPD officers' performance. The GMA and interview, when combined, also explained 25% of the variance in JAPD officer job performance. No other combinations were found to be better than these 2 scenarios. As they are both equal in predicting job performance, it is important to consider other factors that play a role in the selection process. Desi will continue that conversation by discussing the ABBH Consulting utility analysis and adverse impact analysis findings.
Thank you, Mr. Harding. In order to assess the worth of current assessment methods based on relative cost against predictive power, a utility analysis was conducted. ABBH utilized Taylor-Russell tables to predict the percentage of new hires that would be successful. Currently, the performance of half of the present workforce is seen as successful, making our base rate 0.5 or 50%. During a previously run analysis in the data collection phase, the composite validity of all 4 predictors, the 4 selection methods, was 0.5. This 0.5 means the 4 predictors were strongly related to predicting job performance. Several selection ratios were explored for insight into the percentage of new hires that would be seen as successful. Remember, the selection ratio is the number of open positions divided by the number of applicants. It was found that the most effective selection ratio was 0.10. This led to a projected 84% of new hires being successful. In terms of using the selection ratio information provided by ABBH the JAPD must look at both legal considerations and possible discriminatory hiring occurrences during the hiring process. Presently, the JAPD uses the top-down selection technique for filling vacant positions. While this method has the fiscal benefit of maximizing performance on the criterion variable, which in this case is employee performance, however, the top-down selection technique is often riddled with discriminatory hiring, known as adverse impact. Adverse impact occurs when hiring practices, which appear neutral, discriminates against a protected group of people. Looking at how to calculate the potential occurrence of adverse impact, one must follow the 4/5 or 80% rule. The 4/5 rule states that if the selection rate for a certain group is less than 80% of the group with the highest selection rate, there is adverse impact. ABBH discovered there was adverse impact against the non-minority group when the selection rate was 0.10 and 0.5, but not at 0.9. Keeping in mind the findings of both the utility analysis and the adverse impact report, my colleague Nashima Begum will provide our recommendations to the JAPD.
Thank you, Desi. Based on the research conducted so far, the GMA test seems to be the most promising based on the fact that it has the highest validity compared to other predictors. However, the analyses that Joe and Desi just reviewed left ABBH with two concerns. One is whether to use the structured interviews or the in-basket test in conjunction with the GMA test. And two is whether to use a selection rate of 10%, which was most effective in the utility analysis, or to use a selection rate of 90%, which was the only rate that showed no adverse impact when using the 4/5 rule. Therefore, ABBH conducted further research and analyses to make their final recommendations. After further investigation into the utility of the interview and the in-basket test, ABBH discovered that using either one in combination with the GMA test would produce 52% of newly hired officers being successful. This is very close to the 54% satisfactory performers that would have been achieved by using all four predictors when using a selection ratio of 90%. This is another reason why reducing it to two predictors would result in cost savings for JAPD. Although this is a trade-off from using the 10% selection ratio, ABBH urges JAPD to keep in mind that the adverse impact from using lower selection ratios will make it difficult for the organization to mitigate legal risk via compliance with equal employment opportunity laws. ABBH also researched that predictors minimize subgroup differences and discovered that the structured interviews is the best out of all four predictors because they generally have little or no subgroup differences between men and women or applicants of different races. After reviewing which predictors encompass the most KSAOs, ABBH found that structured interviews cover more of the KSAOs that match the criterion for police officers to perform successfully on the job based on the job analysis. Finally, ABBH also considered the development and administration costs of each selection method. ABBH found that structured interviews are the best out of the four predictors because they typically have moderate development and administration costs. ABBH recommends that JAPD use the composite predictors GMA tests and structured interviews with a selection rate of 90% to better predict future officer performance on the job and to be fair to all applicants, all while making legally compliant selection decisions. Further details on the research, analyses, and recommendations conducted by ABBH can be found in the final technical report. ABBH also suggests that JAPD take into consideration a few additional factors. Currently, JAPD uses four predictors that do not take into consideration the physical component of successful performance of police officers on the job. Adding a physical ability test would improve the likelihood of testing the physical aspect of the job. Another factor is the current use of the top-down selection strategy using regression weights to hire new officers. ABBH suggests that another strategy be applied, such as the Pareto optimization method, which shows promise to simultaneously minimize certain subgroup differences or adverse impact and maximize job performance in new hires. ABBH is willing to provide a more in-depth cost-benefit analysis and comprehensive job analyses should JAPD choose to implement these additional suggestions. One final note for JAPD is that the current data set provided include only black and white selection rates. Adverse impact can affect other subgroups such as male, female, or members of other races. Adverse impact claims can also be made about individual predictors within selection processes. In other words, there is still room for improvement in JAPD's selection process. ABBH is committed to assisting JAPD choose the optimal selection processes that will reduce adverse impact, maintain job performance prediction, and withstand legal scrutiny. We look forward to our continued partnership with JAPD, and now I'll hand it back to Joanne to conclude this presentation.
Thank you, Nishima. That concludes the formal presentation. As a reminder, it's important to ensure that the assessment tests continue to provide adequate predictive validity for prospective officers. ABBH is prepared to offer our services with assessment enhancements and periodic validation reviews in the future. Again, we would like to thank you for the opportunity to partner with JAPD on this project. At this time, we would be happy to entertain any questions.